Good morning and welcome to the Seven Sisters Demonstration Garden here at the SLO County Master Gardeners program. I'm Gary Lawson, one of the Master Gardeners here in the local program, and I'm going to be walking you through a virtual tour of our demonstration garden today. I say virtual because at this point we're not open to the public due to the COVID pandemic. What you can do, though, is visit our website, which we'll have on the screen, our website name, and I'll also have it again towards the end. And that would allow you to review the video we're making today. You can also look at a map of the garden, and we have expanded descriptions of all the garden plots. In addition to that, we have quite a few very informative, educational Instagrams and YouTube videos, as well as quite a few informational pages. So again, just check out the website at your leisure and look for some more information. So let's begin the tour. Is our curb appeal garden plot. The highlights of the curb appeal is to demonstrate what, as a homeowner, you can do in your front or side or backyards, looking at on a year-round basis, providing a sense of not only texture and color that is coming from both annuals, such as the zinnias, are planted by seed. We have a number of perennials, such as the dahlia here, coming from tubers. You get a better sense of the dahlias in our other bed here. Advantages of having these curb appeals throughout the year is it provides food and nectar, pollen for pollinators. And specifically this verbena right now I have growing at home in South County. The goldfinches are really feasting on it. The seeds are quite tiny, such as the Niger seed that you buy to feed the pollinators. In addition, I see that there's a dill plant here, so not only would you feed the pollinators, but you yourself can get some herbs from these curbside plantings. As I mentioned, there's annuals, perennials, some are propagated by seed. The dahlia here is a tuber, so these will come back year after year and throughout the seasons. I also noticed a surprise, there's a pittosporum, which usually is grown as a shrub. It depends upon the species. This one can get up to 25 feet tall, so this may be on a dwarf or miniature pittosporum, but it's nice to have something that's going to be green throughout the year, as some of the flowers will fade and go to seed. Now we'll be entering into the creating and maintaining wildlife habitat garden plot. It's a nice segue from the curb appeal, looking at the types of plants we can use for pollinators. The focus on the wildlife plot is attracting, maintaining a living area for the different types of wildlife in our gardens that many of us want, such as insects and birds. 4 aspects in the wildlife plot is you want to provide a sense of food, and a second would be water, third is space, and then the cover would be the 4th area. So to demonstrate that, we have some bird baths here. Somewhat typical, we've also added these rocks, and I'll show you another example in a moment, but you want to be able to have spots for birds to perch on, as well as butterflies, so they don't have to go right into the deep water. So providing a sense of water that you want to keep clean. So everyday checking. Certainly we're getting ready to have a heat wave here in SLO, so this will be a daily task to make sure it hadn't dried out. As I mentioned, in addition to water, you'll want to think about providing a sense of food. Now the food will come from flowers that will provide both the pollen as well as nectar. And you can see to my right here, the California fuchsias are just now becoming into bloom, and the hummingbirds will absolutely be hanging around this for all day, providing food for the pollinators, specifically using the flowers. In addition to that, you'll have options of looking at seeds and fruit. And behind me here is an example of a tall bush or tree, and this is the coffee berry that earlier in the year the flowers provided nectar and pollen. Now they're going to seed in this fruit. The birds will be feasting on that. That's the coffee berry. Behind me is an example of another native type of buckwheat. This is the St. Catherine's lace. And now that the sun's out, here's a bee right now on here. The bees will be covering this, again, going for the pollen and the nectar. So in addition to the water and the food, whether it's fruit, nuts, or flowers, a third aspect in your habitat garden is going to be providing a sense of cover. Year-round cover. You want to do it both vertically and horizontally. So vertically, like these taller plants, the insects and butterflies can hide in the plants, as well as the stalks on many of these are somewhat pithy, so the insects will burrow into that, lay their eggs, and even overwinter. So providing vertical cover as well as a more lower lying horizontal cover will provide the coverage that the pollinators will need. The last aspect is creating a sense of space for the pollinators to breed and to live. And what we've given example here are some bird houses and some native bee nesting sites. I'll point out these bird houses are not necessarily to scale as far as their height, but we only had so much room to demonstrate. So those are the bird houses, as well as the native bees. Many of them are living in tubes or channels, so you can actually make a native bee nesting site using bamboo, straws, or just garden refuse that has a pithy core. Okay, our next stop is going to be the scent garden. Now we're going to look at the scent garden. An aspect of your home gardens certainly will be capturing the visual aspect of plants, but another dimension would be how can you appreciate scent or smell. And what I have some examples here, these pelargoniums, or geraniums as most of us know, are highly scented, as well as they do provide color too. This lemon verbena will grow into a fairly large bush. Many, or some people I know, will actually make lemon verbena wine. You can ferment that. An example here is the hummingbird mint, or agastache. Again, these are very low water usage, so in a xeriscape you can adapt those. And here's another example of a dill. Not only would you use the fronds for aromatics and cooking, but the seeds are now going to seeds. You can use dill seeds. So again, not only pollinators, but for the homeowner too. Okay, now we're going to go down the path to the California natives. Ornamentals, even though they may be natives. Well, now the subplot we're going to look at now is the California native garden. Some highlights, such as this sage here, will demonstrate that many of our native plants here in California, at least on the Central Coast, because we're in a Mediterranean climate, which is defined in essence by a hot, dry summer, or at least very warm, and the winter is going to be cool and wet. And one of the evolutionary results of that is many of our native plants are going to have a gray-green because the leaves are coated with an oil to help conserve moisture. So you'll find that Mediterranean aspect around the whole world, not just here on the Central Coast. So the sage certainly demonstrates that. This is the end of the season, so they're going to seed now. The goldfinch will like this also because of the tiny seeds. Another example is the ceanothus, which actually different species can be 15, 20 feet tall to some of the more low mounding ceanothus types. These are spring bloomers, and the early pollinators will like that. And that's a concept to think about, is having a planned succession of blooming throughout your garden throughout the year to keep the pollinators fed. Now we're at the kitchen garden. Intensive planting, and that these are on raised beds, as you notice, and you plant them very closely, the different plants that you're using. Now, the advantages of that is that it'll create more shade between the plants, which means less moisture loss, and more importantly, I think sometimes is going to be minimal weeds that'll be growing because they don't have a chance to sprout. In the bed we have here, these are peppers. Again, we're late summer, early fall, so some of our beds are just now being replanted for the cool weather type of crops. An example of what's been growing all summer are some of these tomatoes that we've had to utilize a little extra support. The methods we use in our raised beds here, bringing them up at a height that it makes it easier for some of us to get in here on our knees. We can even sit in a chair if you want. Even if you're in a wheelchair, you can do some access to raised beds. We will line the bottom of the bed with some type of metal fencing, usually hardware cloth, to keep the gophers out. As many of you know, we have plenty of gophers here on the Central Coast. To my right is a fairly new plot. We have the Mediterranean and Channel Islands garden plot. I would guess these have been here about 2 years, and why I point that out, when you are planting perennials such as the ones in the garden here, it's usually safe to think about 3 to 5 years before you can get a plant to a size that you want to show off. It's almost mature at about 3 to 5 years. So these are mid-age in terms of their growth, the Mediterranean garden. Again, we are in a Mediterranean climate here, the dry, warm summers and cool, wet winter. All right, now we're down in the fruit orchard. As I mentioned earlier with the citrus and avocado, you may notice that our fruit trees are again in that 8-9 foot tall range, and we purposefully keep them pruned at that level. In fact, the orchard committee was in just last week, not only pruning to keep the height down, but cleaning out the inside of the interior area of the trees, which will allow for airflow and sunlight, which will greatly decrease the chances of getting diseases. One of the aspects that's highlighted here in the fruit orchard is that you don't need acres and acres to have some fruit trees. In fact, one concept is using multiple trees per planting spot. So with this peach tree, you'll notice the trunks are coated white. That's to keep the sun from burning it. But there's 3 peach trees in this one planting. And in addition to having different types of peaches in the same planting, if you're really industrious, you can experiment and go for grafting, where you would graft or bring onto the mother plant a different variety. And so you could have 4 or 5 different types of peaches on the same tree, just to give you variety. All right, here we are now down in the plant propagation area. the Plant Propagation Committee, it works year-round, taking cuttings as well as collecting seeds from plants we currently have in the garden, and we'll be using those to fill in holes, spaces in the garden, as well as when we have our occasional public sales, we'll be able to sell those cuttings and seedlings. An emphasis in the garden is certainly what the Propagation Committee is using, drought-tolerant natives. So even though it's drought-tolerant, it may take regular water. And with many of our natives, regular water is very important in maybe the first 1 to 2 years. Once it becomes established, then by and large you can let the natural rainfall in the winter suffice. Or in fact, it'll be low water plants. It's not unusual to overwater a native plant and kill it. So it's to, one, be aware of your soil structure. Is it clay? Is it going to hold the water? Or is it very sandy, which the water is going to run right through? So once the plants have gotten started and get to a point that they no longer need to be in the shade area, we'll bring them out into more of the sunlight area. I just want to highlight this Mexican tulip poppy as I walk by. I just think in the sunlight right now, it's absolutely stunning. It's similar to our California poppy. It's going to seed once the flowers stop, and then they'll burst, and seeds will be going everywhere. So we're going over here to look at, now that the plants have hardened off, and now they're beginning to be more sun tolerant. We have some examples of the manzanitas, which are a native, many different species of those. Some will get up to 15 feet tall, and some will actually be very ground hugging and be almost a mound. So again, once they leave the shade cloth area, then we bring them out to more of the full sun. As we've walked through the garden, I would point out many times that when we do our prunings to bring at least the trees down, or even some of the ornamentals, unless they're diseased, we don't necessarily throw them away. In fact, we're going to bring them over here to the compost area and collect them so we can make compost to use in the garden. We'll use both brown material, which are dried plant materials, if you will, and green materials. First you cut them up so you can store them, such as here, and then we're going to send them through the chipper to break them down into much smaller pieces, keeping a ratio of about 50 to 50, so 50 brown, 50% green. If you have too much green, it'll actually create mold and mildew, and that you can't get air in there to help the microbes break down the plant materials. So mixing and chipping the brown and the green. After you've done that, there are several methods of storing your product. This is about midway through. Again, there's no soil in that. These are just plant remains. Leave this sitting for several weeks, keeping it moist, not wet, and turning it aerated. And then once you have let that sit for several weeks, you'll end up with a finished product, which we in the garden call black gold. Welcome to the Fire Safe Demonstration Garden. What we're trying to highlight here are the principles that are given to us by CAL FIRE as homeowners, how to lower the availability of fire and fuel to your home in case of a fire. So the first principle is, within 3 feet of your home, you want a non-combustible material, such as this decomposed granite. Yes, there are some pressure-treated lumber in there, but this again would suffice for non-combustible granite, sand, something that will not bring on the flames next to the house. So that's within 3 feet. The next zone, zone 2, would be within 30 feet of your structure. You would be advised to have very low flammable, low growing shrubs. This is called the defensible zone, in which if there were a house fire, firefighters would be able to get into the area and work next to the house in terms of battling the fire. So examples we have here are some more of the California fuchsias that we talked about. Some of the buckwheat that we looked at earlier here too. Big example of, it may be muted, but it's just a very beautiful pastel. The pinks and the oranges now that it's going to seed. So again, that's within 30 feet of the house. And then out further than that, up to 100 feet, you want to have an area that isn't high flammable. An example, you can use mulch. Yes, mulch, this wood chips will burn, but it's very low flammable, and that it would more smolder than it would actually have flames going into it. So again, you want the non-combustible within 3 feet of the house. The defense zone is 30 feet, and then because of the scale of the garden, we can't show the 100 feet out in terms of keeping your trees limbed up to about 8 feet, 6 to 8 feet. Our last stop on the tour today is going to be the succulent and cactus garden. To my right here is a bed of agaves. What many of us think of as cactus plants are exemplified in this bed here. They can either be the columnar types, and these are sometimes called a fence post cactus, such as this Peruvian here, or the barrel cactus, the more round golden barrel shapes. We wouldn't recommend planting succulents and cactus in this adobe soil like we have here. We think that our saving grace is because it's on such a slope that the water drains down into the fruit area. Even within the succulent beds that we have here, it can be considered almost microclimates. The walnut tree will provide shade through most of the year-round. So a number of the plants here will be in shade, which actually succulents like a filtered light. They're not necessarily heat-loving. We do have one small section here that we're devoting and developing for a North County. For here, that would be areas such as Paso Robles or Atascadero, because they have much hotter summers and colder winters than we do down here in South County. An example of one yucca that's blooming right now, and the hummingbirds will like this too, is a red yucca. Many of the succulents are actually coming alive right now. We're moving into the early fall. That's the cool weather. That's when they will do their most growth. They're still alive in the summer, but many of them will kind of shrivel up and you think, oh, they're dead. Nope, they're just in their summer dormancy. Well, that brings us to a close of the Seven Sisters demonstration garden. Again, we'll have on the screen below the website that you can go and revisit, as well as get in communication. Send us your questions to the SLO County Master Gardeners Group. Thank you for joining us today.